This is the final episode of our first season of Feminist by Design at the Global Center for Gender Equality. So far, we've discussed how, if we want to advance gender equality, we have to understand how systemic sexism draws strength from the military-industrial complex, terrorist designations, disaster capitalism, colonialism, and anti-communism. In this episode, we're going to make a few more connections and talk about the power of shifting power, specifically in philanthropy. When people talk about shifting power in philanthropy, they're usually talking about grant-making reforms. But we want to talk about something that takes it a step further, a movement to use philanthropy to end philanthropy. Some call the philanthropists involved in this movement class traders, wealthy individuals who want to not just change how we think about wealth, but who are working toward the radical redistribution of wealth. And in the course of our research, we learned a curious fact. The majority of these class traders are women. Of course, the next generation of philanthropists is typically seen as more radical than the last, but there is a lot of historical precedent for philanthropists breaking rank and supporting sweeping social change. They were radical not just in their generosity, they deployed the full force of their influence. So if you feel radical among your peers or family, or want to be even more bold, you're in good company. There are many examples of radical philanthropy when we look back. There's the Tappan brothers, who financed and actually founded the American Anti-Slavery Society, which shifted public sentiment on one of the most polarizing issues the U.S. has ever faced. Another example we see is at year zero in Western feminism, women's suffrage. Women's suffrage also benefited from the support of big donors, so much so that Susan B. Anthony called it, quote, the vital power of all movements, the wood and water of the engine. Even then, the movement suffered from chronic underfunding. And while American suffragettes were fighting for the right to vote, they were also throwing their weight behind and against U.S. imperial acquisition of colonies like the Philippines, Guam, Puerto Rico, and Hawaii. The civil rights movement was also supported by foundations that provided resources and training for movement leaders to mobilize more effectively. We're not saying philanthropists should be credited for ending slavery and women's disenfranchisement, but their outsized influence is undeniable, and sometimes society-changing. Today, philanthropists' influence over our lives is actually growing. According to author and academic Lindsay McGoey, the amount of charitable foundations in the U.S. has doubled since 2000. Today, billionaire philanthropists, quote, hold more power over education policy, global agriculture, and global health than ever before. As a Filipino, I can't think about the power of philanthropy without thinking about Andrew Carnegie and the fact that he made an offer that could have changed the course of history for the Philippines and maybe even the American Empire. When Spain lost the Spanish-American War, the U.S. purchased the Philippines, Puerto Rico, and Guam as part of the Treaty of Paris for the price of $20 million. That would be about $750 million today. Carnegie was a card-carrying anti-imperialist. He was so opposed to America's purchase of the Philippines that he offered to donate the same sum to the people of the Philippines so they could purchase back their independence. It unfortunately didn't happen, but Carnegie was willing to use his immense wealth to push the U.S. off the path of imperialism. The catch, of course, was that the system of capitalism, and not any single person, was pushing the U.S. into imperialism. And systems are much bigger forces than a single philanthropist can reckon with alone. And Andrew Carnegie was not exactly anti-capitalist. Carnegie was a steel billionaire, best known for being one of the richest men in America. In fact, at his peak, he was about $120 billion richer than Elon Musk. Unlike Musk, he saw philanthropy as an antidote to capitalism, but in the sense that philanthropy was a good way to pacify social protests. His book, The Gospel of Wealth, was a defense of wealthy do-gooders that contended that the wealthy know best. This is in the bones of how philanthropy works today. And it's also why it's so interesting to see some radical philanthropists, tired of this paternalistic approach, out here breaking those bones. This emerging group of philanthropists are also known as class traders. Rachel Sherman is the Michael E. Gellert Professor of Sociology at the New School for Social Research and is the author of the forthcoming book, Class Traitors.
Class trader, it's a little bit of a complicated term. I'm not entirely comfortable with it myself, and certainly not all of the people that I'm speaking to would call themselves class traders. But the reason I think it's an effective way to talk about what they do is because they're working to undermine the conditions of existence of their own class. So ideally, their class would not exist.
Let's think about what that really means for a moment. That their class, whether we're talking about the 10%, the 1%, or the 0.1%, would be phased out. And that's a pretty radical idea, especially if you consider how unfettered growth is a fundamental feature of capitalism. In episode 3, we discussed how there are political and ideological strings attached to humanitarian aid, and the strings often require being on the right side of those in power, which really means being on the right side of capitalism, which also often means being on the right side of the United States. And as we know, incentivizing pro-capitalism and U.S. interests leads to inequality. Inequality is a design feature of capitalism. This is why philanthropy and capitalism are usually considered to be two sides of the same coin. And this emerging group of Western philanthropists are worried about it.
One of the reasons it's complicated that I want to mention is that I don't think that they see this as actually going against the interests of other people in their class. They believe that making these changes will benefit them also, right? It's not a question of noblesse oblige and like if we don't give scraps to the masses, they're going to come after us. It's like actually having wealth at these levels can be very damaging for people and harmful often to the planet. They're analogous to white anti-racists who want to change systems of white supremacy, right, that benefit them. So from the perspective of being beneficiaries of a system that they think is immoral, essentially, and they're trying to change that system.
This is a huge shift in Western culture and values.
But for me, what's important is that I think people like this, and I hope my own work is contributing to this, are just pushing against these deeply kind of common sense, like taken for granted ideas about what good people are, that good people are accumulators. You know, there's no such thing as having enough money. Basically, you just don't talk about it. You kind of pretend it isn't there. So it'll just keep accumulating. And then you pass it on. And what class traders are saying is like, no, I'm not going to pretend it isn't there. I have this money. I don't need most of it. And I'm going to try to use it not just in some general, generic, charitable way, but in order to change a system that I find to be unjust and harmful.
Let's be real. With enough money, some of us can be free, even while others are not. So it's remarkable that these class traders not only think more collectively, but believe that huge wealth isn't a mark of virtue, but rather the opposite. And while individuals don't fully control how wealth distribution functions, it's important to identify who's trying to change things as a first step. This is where women, even more than men, are making a difference.
I mean, there's some patterns among class traders that maybe predispose them. I would say there are more women than men in this field. And I think that's because women, I don't want to overgeneralize, but as a rule, I think men are really socialized to think that accumulating wealth is good and means that they're successful. And I think women are somewhat less socialized to put their self-worth like into their bank account. Plus, of course, they have many fewer opportunities to accumulate, right? There's not that many women billionaires.
There are some. Mackenzie Scott has been making headlines when it comes to wealth redistribution. Between her announcing her intention to empty the safe in 2019, she's given away a total of $16.5 billion in hundreds of no-strings-attached grants. By comparison, Andrew Carnegie gave away $350 million over his lifetime, equivalent to about $6.2 billion today. Scott has more than doubled that in only 5 years, and the number of women billionaires is growing and expected to keep growing. Unless there are major reforms to inheritance tax policy, more wealth will be in the hands of women than ever before. But we can't rely on that fact alone to move more money to women's causes or change the way money and power consolidate at the top in this system. Like we talked about earlier in the series, being a woman doesn't make you a feminist, much like being rich doesn't make you a philanthropist. But feminist philanthropy can create communities where wealthy women can heal from their own patriarchal wounds by acting against patriarchy.
many elite people are raised in an environment, that's really about perfectionism, which creates a lot of anxiety. They're afraid to fail. They're afraid to take risks. They are often see themselves as isolated. I interviewed one woman who described herself as having grown up in a padded room, by which she meant it wasn't literally a padded room, but something that kind of keeps you safe, but also prevents you from engaging in the world. I think a lot of people have had that experience and they feel very isolated. Part of the thing about being isolated is that, it's helpful and healthy and restorative to come into community and collective with other people who may or may not be wealthy in the service of that kind of change.
If you're a philanthropist, chances are that you know where power is hiding and how it works. Very few individuals have the power to make actual change as one person.
The people I've spoken to are not interested in being individuals making change at an individual level. These are people who are interested in helping to strengthen collectives. So part of what it means to give up power is to not want to be the protagonist of social change. And then to the extent that these class traders are participating in a more collective projects, I think they run up against the same thing that every individual trying to affect change runs up against, which is largely that wealthy people have too much money and the corporations have too much power. So the obstacles that are faced by social movements in general.
Andrew Carnegie understood this and was a big proponent of progressive tax reform. Today, it's a whole school of philosophy and activism. Limitarianism, promoted by feminist philosopher Ingrid Robbins, is an idea that individual wealth isn't individual at all, and so the state should put a literal limit on it. There's even an initiative called the Enough Project that's working with high net worth philanthropists to question accumulation and to try to figure out what is enough for each individual. Get ready for me to draw the connection. Philanthropy is underwritten by taxpayers. The Institute for Policy Studies estimates that for every dollar a billionaire donates to charity, taxpayers chip in as much as 74 cents in lost revenue, and that the direct taxpayer subsidy for charitable giving is $111 billion a year, not including potentially hundreds of billions in lost capital gains tax revenue. In effect, taxpayers are heavily subsidizing the growing power of philanthropy over our lives. So we were curious about the growing number of philanthropists agitating for tax reforms today, some to address tax breaks for charitable donations, and others who are advocating for the wealthy to pay a higher share of taxes. That's right, there are some wealthy people who are fighting to change tax law so that they and other people in their class have to pay what they consider to be their fair share. One such group is Patriotic Millionaires. Founded in 2010 to demand an end to the Bush tax cuts for millionaires, they advocate for a fairer system that meets the needs of regular folks, not just the wealthy. They focus on a highly progressive tax system as one strategy to deliver on this. We spoke with one of their members about her motivations for getting involved.
I think that the income inequality impacts everything that we're doing. And so Patriotic Millionaires is something I joined because it just makes sense. Those people who do have money, we have money because of a system that's set up, that is supported by our government, by our rules. And so we're obviously benefiting from it, and yet we also want to provide for our future generations. We need to look to our children and our children's children. And so reinvesting that money that we've made back into the future just makes total sense.
Cynda Collins Arsenault is also a philanthropist who's devoted her work and giving to the dream of a world without war.
I was very influenced during the Vietnam War. I was out in Berkeley, which was the hotbed of everything that was happening at the time, and it definitely influenced my values, my beliefs, my vision, the idea that we really could get to a world beyond war, and it was a rejection of a lot of things, materialism, racism, things that I had grown up as a part of the world. And so that's kind of where I got started with my values. And at the time, one of my values was very much anti people who had money. I had this belief that you really could only be happy if you were poor and struggling. So it was a little ironic that later my husband ended up being very successful in business, and we found ourselves with money, which was a predicament for me at the beginning until I figured out that you can actually do something with it. I did years of research, actually, because not knowing anything about philanthropy, what could a foundation do? Both of our main goals is how do we get to a world beyond war? And so I read everything I could get my hands on.
Patriotic Millionaires sees the current historic levels of wealth inequality as destabilizing, and part of what they're fighting for is a guaranteed living wage for all and a fair tax system. The rich advocating for the system to tax them more is a big change, and big changes can feel naive and impossible sometimes. And that is by design. Capitalism doesn't want you to change it. Old systems want to survive. But it's also important to remember that these systems are new in the grand scheme of things.
I got a lot of my learnings from Buckminster Fuller. One of the things he said was that social change happens most often when a better idea comes along. And so it's that idea of what is the world we want and how can we get there, and looking to the future.
It might be hard to imagine today, but capitalism was a contested system within my parents' lifetime. Let's not forget the Cold War. In fact, it was actually pretty recent in our history that capitalism was far from a foregone conclusion for how world economies would be structured. As we said on our first episode, all systems have an origin story, which means they can also have a grand finale. Systems can be changed. When we know how power operates, we can begin to contest it and envision change. And then we can create new systems. This is what we mean by feminist by design. Cynda is a role model example of this kind of system change thinking. Her approach to philanthropy is not from a charity mindset, but one of feminist philanthropy.
If you look at the larger foundations, the whole concept of philanthropy still has that image of the rich white man who wants his name on a building. It's not addressing systems change. And I think that it's still dominated with a charity mindset. We're going to help the poor people rather than we're going to change the system so that we don't have that situation.
We must change the system so we don't have that situation. We must design a new system. As much as we love a radical philanthropist, we can't leave it up to individuals. We have to create a process for philanthropists to practice feminism in a coordinated and guided way, a community. One of my worries is that in preparing for the great gender wealth transfer, finance and philanthropy will focus on training women to manage wealth instead of supporting them to radically distribute it. This is why the Global Center for Gender Equality is more than a podcast, and why we created the Feminist by Design system, which is more than just empowering individual women. It's about using wealth to reshape the very systems that produce wealth inequality and patriarchy to begin with. Good intentions and really smart women alone aren't enough to end gender inequality. We need a structured, ecosystem-wide campaign that fosters feminist giving strategies and portfolios, and that happens in between all our panels, luncheons, retreats, and conferences. The Feminist by Design system is a first-of-its-kind donor education program and interactive playbook that's explicitly feminist, and for women with wealth who want to step deeper into intersectional feminism. I appreciate that you joined us for this series. It's my hope that when the episode stops, you start. I hope that you'll question more than you did before tuning in. I hope that you'll challenge patriarchy in all you do. Just because it's all we've ever known doesn't mean it's eternal. I hope that if you're in philanthropy or are a philanthropist, that you'll draw on the expertise of the Global Center for Gender Equality. But mostly, I hope that you know that you're part of a tradition of hope. A tradition that believes we have the opportunity every day to create a world that is feminist by design. Thank you for listening to Feminist by Design, a podcast brought to you by the Global Center for Gender Equality. I'm your host, Khara Jabola-Carolus. This show was created, executive produced, and written by Maggie Hellis and me. Producing, sound design, and mixing by Elizabeth Nakano. Narrative editing and development by Arwen Nix. Special research and production by Erica Fotheringham. Cover art by Maggie Hellis. To learn more about the Global Center for Gender Equality, check out our show notes.